It's my first time testing this out. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Okay, I'll just sketch out what we're going to do very quickly before we dive into this. So essentially, I'm going to go over evidences, and then from the evidences that I present, we're going to derive a fact. There will be a total of 3 facts, and then after that, we're going to have a Q&A, because I know sometimes the facts won't resonate, or people would want more information on those, and I'd be very happy to go into detail with those. But right now, let's just dive into the evidence. So today, we'll be investigating the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. As we gather evidence, we will arrive at various facts, which we will piece together to create a whole picture, with each fact building on the last. But first, I would like to start by recounting an interaction that I had with a gentleman about this very topic. The gentleman told me that the resurrection of Jesus is a fairy tale, and that there is no evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. It's just something that helps believers sleep better at night. I said that was possible, but when we consider the scholarship, archaeology, and the historical facts surrounding the resurrection, which are things that fairy tales don't have, there is a strong case to be made for the resurrection. I went on to say, scholars like Dr. Richard A. Burridge changed scholarship on this very topic by showing that the gospel accounts are properly labeled as ancient Greco-Roman biographies, which tend to focus on a single subject using prose narrative and are meant to emphasize the subject's character through their actions, teaching, and death. That is distinct from a fairy tale or even modern biographies, which tend to focus more on chronological events or psychological development of a subject. To simply assume that the resurrection of Jesus is a fairy tale is a direct misrepresentation of scholarship. The gentleman then became flustered and then went on to explain that I had no idea what I was talking about. So when he finished, I said this: "If you don't want to believe me, that's fine. But at least believe the ancient sources and scholars who agree that Jesus is a historical person who died, and then after his execution, something extremely strange happened on Easter morning." As evidence for my claim, I referenced sources such as Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, Lucian, and Mara Bar Serapion, as well as modern scholars, which would include Bart Ehrman, Gerd Lüdemann, Anthony Flew, and Pinchas Lapide. The gentleman quickly replied with, "Well, you can't use Christian scholars or Christian sources to prove your point." At that moment, a subtle smile came across my face as I gently informed him that I did not mention a single Christian in that list of authorities. After I said that, the silence in the room was so loud and thick that I cut it with the following thought experiment. I said to him this in passing. I said, "Imagine living in a world where non-believers tell themselves that Jesus' resurrection is just a fairy tale because it helps them sleep better at night." I tell you this story to communicate that people don't actually look into the evidence. Few people understand that the truth or falsity of the resurrection changes how we should live our lives, our perception of reality, the probability of the existence of God, and the possibility of an afterlife. When talking with unbelievers, I try to use sources that they would find as authoritative, which is why I appeal to extra-biblical sources, such as ancient historians, as well as modern-day scholars who are atheists, agnostics, or non-Christians. You may have heard of a few names I mentioned earlier, such as Josephus or Tacitus, but you may not know these sources or what they say and how to link them to the resurrection of Jesus, but that's what we're going to learn today. According to one of the top atheist scholars named Bart Ehrman, he said the following 2 quotes. Quote 1, "If there had been only one source of Christian antiquity that mentioned a historical Jesus, you could argue that this person just made Jesus up, and everyone else took the ball and ran with it. But how could you make a convincing case if we're talking about 30 or so independent sources that know there was a man named Jesus? These sources are not living in the same village someplace. They didn't compare notes. They are independent of one another and are scattered across the Mediterranean." End quote. This quote from one of the top atheistic scholars in New Testament textual criticism just said that Jesus is not a made-up fairy tale, that he actually existed, and that we have around 30 independent sources for Jesus, which solidifies his historicity. In another quote, Dr. Ehrman goes on to say the following, quote, "This is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. The reason for thinking Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested to in early sources. If you don't want to go where the evidence goes, then be a mythicist. I think atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's what you're going to believe, you just look foolish." End quote. If you didn't know, mythicism is the view that Jesus never historically existed. But according to scholars, this view is foolish and does not stand up to criticism. Jesus is so well attested that we have more literary sources for Jesus than for the Roman emperor of his time, which was Tiberius Caesar. Within the first 150 to 200 years, we have about 10 sources for Tiberius, with 4 main ones being Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. But this pales in comparison with Jesus, who had around 30 literary sources. Not only do we have more literary sources for Jesus than for Tiberius, but the sources for Jesus are closer to the life of Jesus than for the life of Tiberius. Therefore, not only do we have more sources for Jesus, but many of these sources are early. Think about this. There must be something special about this carpenter named Jesus, who lived in a backwater town, had 12 disciples, went on to form a 2 to 3 year ministry, and then died a criminal's death. On the face of it, it doesn't seem like an impressive life. Why would this man have more written about him than the most powerful man on the planet, which was Tiberius Caesar? After all, in those days, knowing how to write was rare and expensive. These people weren't writing fairy tales. They were writing about a historical person. The atheist scholar Richard Carrier, who has defended mythicism, says, quote, "Even if Jesus didn't exist, the origin of Christianity still must be explained by the belief that someone had been risen from the dead. Therefore, we can safely conclude that Jesus existed as our first fact, due to Richard Burge dispelling the myth that Jesus was a fairy tale, Jesus having an abundance of ancient sources, which we will talk more about later, as well as quotes from atheist scholars. We have obtained our first fact. The first fact is that Jesus existed historically. That would be fact number 1. Next, let's introduce some extra-biblical histories, which will also bolster fact number 1, but lead into fact number 2. This is where Cornelius Tacitus comes in, who was a Roman senator and historian. In Book 15, chapter 44, Tacitus writes the following, quote, "Christus, from whom the name Christian had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. This pernicious superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out in Judea, the first source of the evil, but then it broke out in Rome. This is enemy attestation from a non-Christian source, which explicitly places Jesus' execution, aka the extreme penalty, which is a reference to crucifixion, under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. This is obviously not a flattering account, considering Tacitus called Christianity an evil superstition. However, enemy attestation can be extremely valuable and reliable despite its denouncements. From this quote, we can safely say that Tiberius Caesar and Pontius Pilate were contemporaries of Jesus, and that Jesus met a criminal's death. But let's just not take what Tacitus says. Let's look to another enemy of Christianity, such as the Pharisees, and that's where Flavius Josephus comes in. In Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Chapter 3, Section 3, which is known as the Testimonium Flavianum, it says this, quote, "At this time there was Jesus, a wise man. Pilate, upon hearing him accused by the men of highest standing among us, condemned him to be crucified. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared." Now, someone may interject and say that this passage is disputed and was later changed by Christians just to add to the historicity of Jesus and his crucifixion. And then I would say, that's right. Scholars do think this passage was tampered with, which is exactly why I didn't read that passage. I read the version that scholars agree on. If I read the manuscript that we have, it would convey the following, quote, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works or miracles. He drew over to him both Jews and many Gentiles, and he was the Christ. Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had him condemned to the cross, end quote. I like to read the passage that scholars agree on, but the actual text is what you just heard. There is actually groundbreaking research going on right now about this very passage by a Yale scholar named T.C. Schmidt, regarding how this passage is actually accurate to what Josephus originally wrote. Yet even in the critical, pared-down reconstruction that secular scholars agree on, Josephus and Tacitus both report that Jesus was condemned to death. But that's not all. We have a Syriac letter from a Syrian philosopher named Mara Bar Serapion, who was writing a letter to his son. We actually have this letter, and it's currently held in the British Museum. And here's what it says, quote, "What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. Nor did their wise king die for good, for he lived on in the teaching he had given." Most scholars agree that the wise king of the Jews that was mentioned by Mara Bar Serapion was a direct reference to Jesus. And this makes sense, because Jesus is well known for being a wise teacher. And according to one of our earliest sources, Pontius Pilate ordered a sign or title to be fastened to the top of Jesus' cross, which read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." The fact that we discover from these non-biblical histories was that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. John Dominic Crossan, a critical scholar, says that he, referring to Jesus, was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. On top of that, the Journal of the American Medical Association adds that, quote, "interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge," end quote. After all, Jesus had to exist in order to die. That was fact number one. And he had to die in order to later be resurrected. That's fact number two. So far, so good. We have collected two facts. Fact one was that Jesus existed, and fact two is that Jesus died by crucifixion. Next, let's uncover fact number three. In Josephus' work, Antiquity of the Jews, he writes about Jesus' followers by writing the following, quote, "Those that loved him did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so-called named after him, are not extinct to this day," end quote. Many scholars think Christian hands embellished this line as well, but even some critical skeptics acknowledge that this passage is a very early witness to the belief of Jesus' followers that he appeared to them alive again after his crucifixion. Now, let's not put the cart before the horse and jump to the part which references a resurrection, but rather let's focus on the belief of Jesus' disciples. We can get more information about what the early disciples believed, the non-believers, what they believed, and even skeptics believed about Jesus. We can do this by looking to Pliny the Younger and his letter to Emperor Trajan in Book 10, letter 96 and 97. And Pliny writes this, quote, "They were in the habit of meeting on a fixed day of the week." He's referring to Christians here. "Before it was light, they sang alternate verses to a hymn, to Christ as to a God," end quote. Now, to me, this is fascinating because this is early enemy attestation that Christians worshipped Jesus as God from the beginning. And this is also backed by archaeology in the form of the Megiddo mosaic, which is an early ancient inscription which says that Jesus is God. But why would religious Jews who hold to strict monotheism say that Jesus was God? Well, it's simply because they interacted with him after his resurrection, or they knew someone who had interacted with Jesus after his resurrection. Listen to what critical scholars have to say about this. Quote, "It is an indisputable fact that the earliest Christians believed that Jesus was risen from the dead." That's James D.G. Dunn, an agnostic. Or how about this quote? "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ." That's the atheist Gerd Lüdemann, a New Testament critic. Or what about this quote? "The disciples' conviction that they had seen the risen Christ is a part of historical bedrock fact known past doubt. What the disciples saw was not the result of deception or delusion." That's Paula Fredriksen. These scholars that I'm quoting are not friends to Christianity, but the evidence compels them to affirm our third fact, which is that friends, skeptics, and enemies experienced or interacted with the risen Christ. As a reminder, fact number 1 was that Jesus existed. Fact number 2 was that Jesus was crucified. And fact number 3 is that friends, skeptics, and enemies experienced or interacted with the risen Jesus. With these 3 facts, you can make a bare-bones case for the resurrection of Jesus, because if Jesus truly existed, and he truly died, and after his death many people truly interacted with him, then we have a resurrection, or at least a revivification on our hands. Essentially, we established that Jesus was alive at point A, that he died at point B, and was alive again at point C. A resurrection fits this data perfectly. In other words, in the words of the late atheist philosopher Anthony Flew, he says, quote, "The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity," end quote. Even one of the best late Jewish scholars, who thinks Christianity is a perversion of Judaism, named Pinchas Lapide, said the following, quote, "I accept the resurrection of Jesus not as an invention of the community of disciples, but as a historical event." To hear that coming from a non-Christian scholar is absolutely amazing. We are barely scratching the surface of the facts and evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. There are about 12 solid facts that we could point to, which cohesively make an amazing case for the resurrection. But I decided just to use 3 here today for the sake of time, and we did this without referencing a single Bible verse. I did that purposefully, but before I close, I do want to make a point about the Bible. When scholars are making these claims and giving evidences for the facts that they are using our earliest sources, which come from the New Testament. As Gary Habermas once said, quote, "If you don't use the New Testament, the skeptics will." Most of our knowledge about Jesus, his life, teaching, character, miracles, and death comes from the New Testament. And that is why even non-Christian scholars use the documents found in the New Testament. Many skeptics and secular historians turn to the New Testament as a valuable historical source, not necessarily for its theological claims, but for the factual details embedded within it. By applying standard methods and various sources, we can evaluate things such as authorship, context, and historical happenings. Researchers can extract insights about the first century Judea and their political climate in Rome, and the existence of key figures like John the Baptist, Pontius Pilate, and Jesus of Nazareth. Even when approaching these texts with doubt, scholars often acknowledge that it contains references to real people, cultural practices, and events that align with archaeological findings and non-Christian writings. In this way, the New Testament functions not only as a religious document, but also as a piece of ancient literature that constitutes a broader understanding of history. One of the key reasons skeptics engage with the New Testament is that it overlaps with other known historical sources. This is one of the reasons why Pinchas Lapide and Anthony Flew agree that the resurrection of Jesus has great evidence which supports its historicity. For example, it has reference to Roman governance, taxation systems, and figures like Pontius Pilate, which aligns with our best Roman records and archaeological discoveries. This provides external data points of comparison that help scholars evaluate the reliability of the gospel accounts and Paul's epistles. Even if one questions the miraculous elements, these overlapping references lend credibility to the idea that the texts are rooted in real historical circumstances. Another important aspect to look into would be the multiple independent sources within the New Testament itself, including the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which offer different perspectives on similar events, and while they are not identical, their points of agreement can be analyzed to identify core narratives that are more likely to be historical than not. Furthermore, the New Testament provides detailed insights into the social customs, religious debates, and everyday life in ancient Judea and the broader Roman Empire. Descriptions of practices such as synagogue gatherings, public executions, and interactions between Jewish leaders and Roman authorities are consistent with what historians have uncovered. This consistency reinforces the idea that even if the New Testament documents have theological intentions, they are still anchored in real-world settings that can be studied and understood. Ultimately, the engagement of skeptics with the New Testament highlights an important thing. Despite its spiritual claims, they can also end up being historical claims. I will close with a Bible verse from Romans 8:11, and it says this, quote, "And if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you, then he who raised Christ from the dead will also bring your mortal bodies to life through his Spirit who lives in you." And that is a promise. To those who believe in Jesus for salvation, if you believe in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus for the atonement of your sins, thereby trusting in Jesus for your salvation, then you too will experience the promise of Romans 8:11. Thank you. So now we're going to transition into a time of question and answer. I know that was a lot of information. I don't know if you want this mic back.
I can run it for you.
That was a lot of information that we went through. I have around 7 different videos which go through various extra biblical topics as well as historical sources that align with the Bible. So if anyone has any general questions, feel free to flag down Eric and he will pass the microphone over to you.
Okay, so this question doesn't really come from me. It comes from a good friend of mine. He likes to ask this question to stump me. But he asks that, before Jesus, we were sacrificing animals to atone for our sins. He asked me one time, and I didn't know how to answer it, and this might sound very weird or something, but he said, if God is so great, he's the creator of all things, why did he have to send Jesus to be the ultimate sacrifice? Why couldn't he just say, okay, no more sacrificing animals, just whoever believes in me as God, without having to send Jesus to die on the cross, just believe in me, and through me your sins will be forgiven. I had no way to answer that at all. I don't know. So I want to hear your answer, and maybe I can relay it back to him.
Sure, that's an excellent question. So essentially, it's almost like he's describing the God of Islam. So the God of Islam is very arbitrary in the sense of he can just forgive people just like that and just blink at sin. However, the Christian God, who's triune, he is ontologically just and loving. So to blink at sin would not be just. Wrongdoers must be punished and justice must be done. So that's why a sacrifice must be provided in some capacity to fulfill God's justice. And that leads us to the cross, because through the cross, God got to show both his love and his justice, thus ontologically fulfilling his own commitment, and that's why he can accept us as his children, essentially. But yeah, God is he does not just blink at sin. Sin must have a penalty. And the most, you can tell your friend, according to the Bible, I believe it's in Leviticus, it says that the life is in the blood. So according to ancient Judaism, there's nothing more valuable than life. So that's why a life had to be paid for it, because that's how serious sin is to God.
Thank you. That was actually very clear, and I can tell him that now. So it's because we have a just and loving God.
That's right.
Yeah, okay,
you got that right. Yep.
How did I not think of that?
Here. Okay, so, all right. So I'm married to a non-believer, and I've tried before to explain in a much less effective way than you did everything that you just said, and what always seems to be the hang-up for me is it's like you can believe that Jesus was real, you can believe that he was crucified, and you can believe those two things and not be a Christian. But you have to believe that he came back in order to be a Christian. That's kind of where things seem to fall apart, at least when I try to retell it, because it's like, the disciples, all of them except for John, went and did great things and died horrible deaths because of what they believe. And I guess my wife's retort to that was, well, a lot of people do delude themselves into thinking things and then go live their lives according to that, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. So how would you respond to that? What kind of evidence would you use to say that it wasn't just some delusion, that they were deluding themselves into thinking they saw Jesus again?
Yeah, I would quote Paula Fredriksen, which says that the disciples seeing Jesus, I think I have the quote. Hey, Eddie, could you pull up, just go to the slides and press Control F and then type in Paula Fredriksen, and we'll pull that quote back up. And then I also want to touch on the other half of your question as well. While he's pulling that up, I can address the second half of it. So a lot of people die for what they think is true, but the disciples were in a unique position to know whether or not what they believed is true. I'm not going to say that they were lying because liars make poor martyrs. You don't normally die for something that you know to be a lie. Now, people like Muslims or Mormons will die for what they think is true, but the disciples were in a unique position to know whether or not they saw the risen Jesus or not. So that's how it would differentiate them from other people who would die for what they believe is true, but the disciples don't fall in that category. They were dying for something that they actually saw or interacted with. The other people are just dying for what they believe is true, but they are not in a position to know whether or not it is true. If that answers the first part of your question. And then you also alluded to whether or not the disciples were deluded. But then again, I would quote Paula Fredriksen, who says this, quote, "The disciples' conviction that they had seen the risen Christ is a part of historical bedrock facts known past doubt. What the disciples saw was not the result of deception or delusion." Some pretty strong evidence. Some people would say maybe they hallucinated, or maybe they saw a ghost. In first century Judea, if you were to see a ghost, that is not evidence that somebody is alive. That's evidence that they're dead. You're seeing their spirit, their ghost, and that's how they would interpret it. So they wouldn't say that Jesus would be the resurrected Messiah. They would just say that maybe he's at the right hand of power. But if they saw Jesus again, if it was a hallucination or a apparition appearance, they would not assume resurrection. Resurrection, especially in first century Palestine, would say that resurrection is physical, not ghostly, not ethereal, not see-through and spiritual. Flesh and bone. That's why Jesus says in Luke, he says, "Touch me, does spirit have flesh and bone as I do?" So that's evidence for his physicality, not some passing delusion or hallucination. Mm-hmm.
So I know that the group hallucination theory is an alternative to, obviously they saw something and something really happened. We come to the conclusion that Jesus resurrected from the dead. Group hallucination is an alternative theory. Are there any other failed or other explanations aside from resurrection and group hallucination?
Yes, good question. So there are about, I would say, three main ones. I would say that there's the apparent death theory, the hallucination theory, and the conspiracy theory would be the top ones. So the apparent death theory would essentially say that, Eddie, you can pull up, just put apparent death theory, and those should come up. So there's the apparent death theory, which says that Jesus really didn't die on the cross, right? They only thought he was dead, and then when they put him in the tomb, then he came back and got medical attention, and then went to the disciples and said, "Hey, look, I'm resurrected." That essentially was destroyed by David Strauss in the early 19th century. And he essentially says people who adhere to that theory don't understand how brutal crucifixion is. So crucifixion has three main parts to it. There is no historical evidence of anyone ever surviving a three-phased crucifixion. So you would have the pre-death flogging, and in Jesus' case, he was flogged twice. He was flogged by the Jews and by the Romans. After that, you would go to the crucifix, and then after the crucifix, normally you're up there for days. The third stage is they do the death blow. So it's the flogging, the crucifix, and then the death blow. The death blow can be done in a lot of different ways. It can be a sword or spear through the side, which punctures the heart. You can be shot by a bow and arrow. Dogs can eat you alive, essentially, or they'll light you on fire. But Romans were trained executioners, so the apparent death theory doesn't really hold any water, so to speak. We also have extra biblical evidence in regards to a guy named Quintilian, and he actually verifies with what it says in John that when the centurion stabbed Jesus, that water and blood flowed from his heart, which means he was already dead. Sometimes they also, for the death blow, will break somebody's legs so they asphyxiate faster. So the apparent death theory is not held by any mainstream scholars that I'm aware about. Ever since David Strauss said, people who adopt this theory just aren't familiar with, first century crucifixion process. The next one we already kind of touched on, the hallucination theory. So I won't rehearse that, but I will talk about the conspiracy theory. So a conspiracy theory would say that the disciples all got together after Jesus died and said, hey guys, we're all just going to pretend that he did live, that he lives on. Normally people start conspiracy theories like this because they gain something, right? Normally it's like they gain something relationally, or they gain some power, or they gain prestige or money. What the disciples gained was they got beaten, tortured, and killed. So those are the worst perks of a conspiracy theory. So I don't think they would invent something that would purposely get them beaten, tortured, and killed, and that's why it doesn't make a lot of sense. You also have a lot of embarrassing details about the actual narrative. Like, for instance, in first century Palestine, you wouldn't say that women saw the tomb first. That's an embarrassing detail, because as Josephus records, he says that women's testimony is not admissible in a court of law. So why, if I was trying to make a conspiracy theory, I would want it that the men came and saw it, and there were hundreds of them, right? But really, in all the gospel accounts, only a few women saw it. To put that into a modern day perspective, that's like me trying to make a conspiracy theory, and then I have my first witnesses as children. So I don't think that's going to get off the ground. And like I said, the disciples got beaten, tortured, and a lot of them killed for this. So those are not good perks of a conspiracy theory, and that's why the conspiracy theory doesn't make a lot of sense, especially for people like Paul, who was already an extremely prestigious Pharisee. Why would he give up that status and prestige to become a tent maker and get shipwrecked, stoned, and beaten? It just doesn't make any sense unless he actually interacted with the risen Christ. So those would be the top three theories in regards to the conspiracy theory, the hallucination theory, which we briefly touched on last time, and then the apparent death theory.
So I was very impressed with your slides and the depth of your research. You presented a lot of really interesting sources there, and I definitely want to look through them at some point. I am in a little predicament, so I had a question about how would we use this apologetically towards a person who wasn't as willing to look into these historical sources? I have a non-believing friend who has said before about the Bible and what would extend to these other sources, that these are documents written, in her words, by men in power, and that is kind of an assumption that there could be bias in those documents. I know at one point when we were talking about other types of apologetics, we were talking about, there's another argument in favor of the resurrection, talking about how if God exists and if God can do miracles, then God can do a resurrection. Are there any other alternate arguments or alternate ways you would approach this topic with someone that I guess goes around relying on these sources and documents?
I need a clarification. Are you saying that the person that you would talk to wouldn't find these as authoritative, like extra biblical sources, or that they would, and you would need another argument as well?
Like an argument that wouldn't rely as much on someone's willpower to look into literature. Is there a way you would try reaching someone knowing that that person wouldn't be interested in reading more about the topic, but at the same time you still want to reach them and you still want to make the case for the resurrection without having to fully rely on quoting a source that they wouldn't read?
Yeah, I would essentially compare Jesus to Tiberius in the sense that they don't really need to look into, I would encourage them to look into these sources in the New Testament and the extra-biblical evidence for it. But just on the face of it, I would love to hear their thought of, there's this guy named Jesus. He's a carpenter in a backwater town. He has a 2 to 3 year ministry. He dies a criminal's death. Why are so many things written about this guy? There must be something really, really special about this guy for him to have around 30 independent sources compared to around 10 for Tiberius Caesar within the first 150 to 200 years. So I would kind of ask them, it's don't you think there's something really strange about this guy, Jesus? I would be interested to see how they would explain it. I would also be interested to know with whether or not your friend has an intellectual objection to the evidence, or if it's an emotional objection, because I would treat those very differently. Some people have like intellectual blockages to where if you answer a question, then they would be more open to it. But other people can hide behind intellect, and really it's a heart problem, which is why I like to ask people, if Christianity were true, would you believe it? And a lot of the times they say no. And I said, that is not a good position to be in, because we're assuming it is true, and they're like, no, I don't want to follow the truth. Even if I knew it was true, I wouldn't believe. And then you would have an emotional hang up there. So I would treat that very differently. So it would depend on the individual that you would be talking to. So I guess you would have to seek that out to determine which one would be most effective.
So you were asked about alternative theories, or as to if anything else could have happened, I guess, like, other people believe something else happened. There was this thing a while ago. I had this friend who was a Muslim that was telling me, like, apparently in the Quran it says, like, he ran away, and then there was a second person that looked like him. I don't know if you've ever you talked about this with other, like, Muslims that have ever brought that up. Like, have you, like, what is your, I guess, counter to that specifically, or, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So in the Quran, in Surah 4, Ayah 157, so Surah just means chapter and Ayah means verse. So in the Quran 4:157, it says that they neither killed him nor crucified him, but it was only made to appear so. So from this verse, Muslims will derive a substitution theory that somebody was substituted for Jesus on the cross. Normally they think it's Judas Iscariot. They'll say that Judas was, Allah made Judas would look like Jesus, and then they crucified Judas. However, what I retort to them is, one, there are really no mainstream scholars that would take the substitution theory seriously, including two of their top scholars, such as Shabir Ali and Raza Aslan. They would both agree with me saying that, no, Jesus was crucified, and then they have to allegorize that verse that chapter 4, 157, verse 157. So if they're trying to use a substitution theory, I would point to their own Muslim scholars, and that their own scholars disagree with them. There's also, ironically, another verse in the Quran which literally says that Jesus will die and be risen again to life. And that sounds a lot like a resurrection to me. And that's why the Quran contradicts itself on that point, because it says, one, he was neither killed nor crucified, and then later it says that he just ascends to the Father, but they have another verse that says that he does die and that he did rise again. So it's an internal contradiction for the Quran.
Okay. All right, so just to play devil's advocate, talking about, so you say 30 independent sources, 150 to 200 years after Jesus' death. So I guess I've always had issue with people talking about X years after so-and-so's life, because 150 to 200 years is not all that long, historically speaking, especially for sources in that period. But if you think about it on human terms, that'd be like me trying to write a biography of, like, I don't know, like Thomas Edison. It's like I wouldn't be able to go talk to the guy. I probably wouldn't even be able to go talk to anyone who talked to the guy. I'd have to talk to someone who talked to those people. And in that period where writing is so expensive, there's probably not many written sources that you could go reference. So how could we say that something, so I guess part one, what is the most recent extra biblical source after Jesus' death that you could reference? Two, what would be like the best, like, textual, like, manuscript evidence, because, you know, the autographs probably don't exist for those sources anymore either. What would be the best, like, manuscript evidence for that? How late after the writing of that text are those manuscripts? And I guess how would you reconcile the time gap between that source and Jesus' life to, you know, the human time scale of writing a biography so many years after someone's life?
Yeah, so excellent question. The the first thing I would quote is, I'm not like, for the 30 independent sources, I get that from a atheist scholar, Bart Ehrman, who is a textual critic. But you're exactly right. You would think that 150 to 200 years after the fact, that's a long time. Except we're just referencing the sources that we have. The actual sources are dated much, much sooner. And you're right, we don't have autographed copies of the Gospels, but we can get extremely close with the Apostle Paul in his epistles. Eddie, if you could pull up the slide on 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. That's Gerd Lüdemann quotes that. He says, and I quote, "The elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, no later than 3 years. The formation of the appearance of tradition mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8 falls between that time frame." So he's literally saying that there's a creed codified in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8 within 2 years of the resurrection, of the crucifixion. So I understand how 200 can sound like a lot, but we can trace it all the way back that these other sources are referencing the source that's within 2 years of the crucifixion. So you are right that a 200-year gap is a long time, but those sources are drawing from even earlier sources, and according to an atheist New Testament scholar, he says that we can date this within 2 years of the crucifixion itself. And I would say that's really, really close. But even if we didn't have 1 Corinthians and the creed that's attached to it, even if it took 200 years to write something down, facts don't change in that sense over 200 years. It wouldn't matter if it was written 1,000 years later or if it was written the next day. If a fact is written down, then it will stay that fact for that point onwards, as long as it's not like a temporal, like time bound in that sense. So just because something is written late doesn't mean that it wouldn't be true. But luckily, we have early traditions, such as 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8.
Okay, so I guess just a quick follow-up question is, why don't we just use the other source that's like within 2 years? Like, is it just, you have to like, I don't know why, like, do you have to translate it, or like, is that like a scholar has to be really involved with?
So 1 Corinthians is in the New Testament, and you're right, it was originally written in Koine Greek, which is just common Greek, and then that was translated, which is where we get our English translations from. People normally, regular people, not scholars, don't like to use it because they think that, well, if it's New Testament, just like the gentleman I was talking with, if it's New Testament, then you can't use Christians to support, or Christian sources to support your own claim. But I would remind people that before these books were added to the New Testament, these were just biographies and creeds. These were not religious texts when they were originally written. These were texts that documented history, which were later added under one binding called the Bible, and then it became religious texts. But at first, these are ancient Roman biographies and creedal traditions of what actually happened. Luke writes a very orderly account of, what happens. It's very biographical. So yeah, but it just depends who you're talking to and what they find as authoritative. But like I said at the end, I wouldn't let them dictate what is and isn't authoritative. I am just responsible for communicating truth, and I will just use a plethora of sources, and they'll most likely find one of those avenues as authoritative.
And they their only real reasoning to discredit the Bible is they say it's been translated so many times it could be bias or something, as opposed to this other source that's outside the Bible. That's really the bulk of their argument, right?
Yeah, they're just assuming that the Bible has been corrupted and that somehow this doesn't happen with other manuscripts. So it's kind of like special pleading on their end, except I would say the opposite. Because we have so many manuscripts of the Bible, we have around 25,800 in various languages, that we actually can reconstruct what the originals say to a 99% accuracy. So really, if you're going to dissuade people from reading the Bible and acting as if it's authoritative, you wouldn't be able to trust any ancient literature, because the Bible has, for antiquity at least, has the most manuscripts, the best traditions. So that's kind of how I would appeal to that. It's like if you were going to distrust the Bible, you wouldn't believe anything else from antiquity, because we only have a handful of things, including like the Iliad and the Odyssey and other writings by Homer and a lot of Greek philosophers. We only have a couple of them, or maybe a couple hundred, but we have over 25,000 manuscripts for the New Testament. So if they're going to say don't trust that, it's like I wouldn't be able to trust anything else.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
So within the New Testament accounts, there's a little quirk that I find interesting in the story. That's when Mary just saw that the tomb was empty, and then she first saw Jesus. She didn't recognize him. She thought he was the gardener. And then two of the disciples on the road to Emmaus also didn't recognize Jesus until the very end of their conversation. That's just a really interesting quirk in the story. Are there any critics who use that like as an argument against the resurrection in any case? And are there any arguments that use that as a case, like as an evidential point for the resurrection?
There is one ancient source that I'm forgetting the name of it, but essentially they try to make the case that because Mary didn't see Jesus, like she didn't recognize him at first, maybe it wasn't Jesus, right? Maybe it was the gardener. However, I don't find that very plausible. Because if you were to mistake somebody as the gardener, that's fine, but I don't expect 500 other people to also mistake that same gardener for the same person, unless it's like the actual same person. And when I say the 500 witnesses, I'm referring to the Creed in 1 Corinthians. So I would say that some scholars, again, won't take that route, but I know that some, keyboard warrior atheists will try to front that approach specifically. Mainly scholars will say that those passages that you referred to about Mary not recognizing Jesus and the disciples on the road to Emmaus not recognizing Jesus for a time, that was more of like a spiritual blindness, but not something like physical. There are some commentators that will say, well, maybe Mary was crying and she couldn't see through her tears, but scholars like William Lane Craig would just say this was more of a spiritual blindness that Jesus wanted to reveal himself later to them. So that's how Christians, commentators would sift through that, essentially.
Is there any, like in the literature, a thought I had is that, like we know from when he appeared to Thomas and he said, put your like fingers in my hands and put your hand in my side, that he retained some scars. Is it possible that he was scarred in, like, because he was beaten and torn apart, and in Isaiah 53 it says like he was unrecognizable, like from humankind. Is it possible that he still retained, or do any scholars mention like him retaining the scars on his body afterwards, and that's part of the reason they didn't recognize him?
There is one guy named Chuck Missler who would say that they didn't recognize him because, like you're saying, he references Isaiah 53, and he believes that they literally ripped the beard from Jesus, and it left like like indentations to where he would become unrecognizable. So that would be one Christian commentator that would agree with that. I'm not sure. I have no idea whether or not they did that. That particular narrative isn't narrated in the Gospels, but it is mentioned in Isaiah 53. So could that be a reason for him being unrecognizable to them at first? That's a possibility. I'm just not sure. But yes, there is a Christian commentator that would agree with that.
Okay, so kind of related to my last question, I guess. What, just out of curiosity, what is the manuscript trail, not necessarily for the Gospels, but for like the extra biblical accounts like? And how can we say for sure that it's not some kind of elaborate hoax that, like, I don't know, the Vatican in the Middle Ages came up with and like scattered throughout the Mediterranean area just to convince people and mess with future historians?
Yeah, for that, again, I would just go to Bart Ehrman, when Bart Ehrman says that all of these people for the 30 independent sources weren't all living in the same village somewhere. and they aren't isolated just to one area. These histories have spread all over the Mediterranean. Like Bart Ehrman says, if there was only one original source, and they all lived in the same village, and then they could all copy each other and then go out, that would make sense. But because Bart Ehrman is an atheistic textual critic, he knows that these manuscripts actually originated in different areas because of the languages that they're in. So some written in like Hebrew, others in Greek, others in Aramaic, others in Syriac. So these are all over the Mediterranean, and a lot of people didn't even know all of those different languages. So we have different manuscript traditions that all came all over the Mediterranean. So this wasn't centralized and then became decentralized. This was decentralized and then centralized in the Bible later.
I'll throw a quick question. So you have the facts that you discussed, which are great. I guess like a next best thing would possibly be some type of physical evidence, right? So I guess I'm getting to possibility of like the Shroud of Turin. I was curious what there's been somewhat of a rejuvenation in terms of interest and study of that for the past maybe year or so, but curious your thoughts in terms of the validity of it, the history of it, even the utility in this kind of setting apologetically. So yeah, take it away.
Yeah, that's a great question. Eddie, could you go to the second to last slide on the Shroud of Turin? So I'm not an expert on the Shroud of Turin. I definitely need to do more research on it, but just for everyone to understand, people think that the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth that Jesus was buried in, and then when he resurrected, they believe that Jesus' image was imprinted on that cloth when he resurrected due to a burst of light. This is one of the most well-studied ancient relics of antiquity. There have been more scientific journals and studies written about this one thing than any other relic in antiquity that I'm aware of. There is some very interesting evidence for the Shroud of Turin, including its dating. It dates to the 1st century. It's in the right place at the right time. The person who died in the shroud was a crucifixion victim. At this time, or even in the Middle Ages, you'll see various paintings of crucifixion victims having the nail go through the palm, but that's false. In ancient Rome, you would be crucified through your wrist right here. That would actually sustain the body weight. And the Shroud of Turin gets this correct, that whoever was in this shroud was a crucifixion victim. But there was thousands of people that were crucified. How do we know it's Jesus' crucifixion? Well, one, it's the only one with an image on it. That's point number one. What's so special about this image? This image was not painted on. It's not oil or powder. The image is on there, and it's very, very thin. It's extremely thin, thinner than a hair's breadth, just sitting on top of the shroud. How did it get there? Well, an artist couldn't have done it because any type of paint would have seeped into the fibers of the cloth. They essentially think probably radiation did this, or a burst of light somehow. Now, I'm not really sure what to make of the shroud. I wasn't there, but I do think the shroud is very interesting. There's also other things that point to the shroud's validity, such as there's blood on the shroud. Some people will say, well, it can't really be actual blood from the crucifixion victim because over many years, blood will discolor. It won't stay this bright, vibrant red. Well, if somebody is under a lot of stress, your liver will produce what's called bilirubin. Well, it falls where Jesus' wounds would be, on the shroud. So bilirubin on the shroud would also point to Jesus as well. So there's a lot of, I won't go further into it, even the pollen is dated correctly for the exact place of it. For me personally, I'm not sure what to make of the shroud. I would need to do more research on the shroud. But I do think it is very interesting to say the least. But yes, if this is the shroud that Jesus was buried in and the cloth that he was buried in when he resurrected, and that burst of light from his resurrection is the thing, the smoking gun that put the imprint on the shroud, then that would be really, really good evidence for it would be physical archaeology for evidence for a resurrection.
So as far as archaeological evidence that is there was a mosaic mentioned at one point that we absolutely know like bolsters the argument for the resurrection, or at least Christianity. What's the earliest archaeological evidence that's out there that we know of?
The earliest archaeological evidence I would think would be the Megiddo mosaic. And the Megiddo mosaic says a lot of things on it, but essentially it was a communion table, and it essentially says that Jesus is God, which is remarkable because for a monotheistic Jew, there's no way they're going to call a mere man God. Like, that would just be so blasphemous for a Jew to say that. So these people would likely come from a tradition where they are recipients of a creed that came from eyewitnesses. The Megiddo mosaic would come from around 230. So it's still very early. It's 3rd century. But to say that, to have an inscription that says Jesus is God, and to a Jew, only God can resurrect people, that's why they say Jesus is God, because they believe that either the Father resurrected him or that he resurrected himself. But I would say that the Megiddo mosaic would be the earliest archaeological evidence besides the Shroud of Turin, if the Shroud of Turin is valid. I stake a lot on the Megiddo mosaic because for textual criticism questions, sometimes they'll say that Jesus only became God in the 4th century, right? That over time, myths and legends developed. But if I can point to 1st century and 2nd century archaeology where people are saying that Jesus is God from the beginning, the earliest Christology is the highest Christology, then that blows the legendary development hypothesis out of the water. So I like to point to the Megiddo mosaic, and I would say, putting the Shroud of Turin aside, I would say the Megiddo mosaic would be, for archaeology, if we're not counting like manuscripts or tradition, then I would say the Megiddo mosaic would be the earliest archaeology.
So I know you mentioned mainly you say you try to use sources that are outside of Christianity to for the validity of people who are outside. Do you know of any sources that are people who started outside of Christianity and then through studying it became Christians?
Yes, there is at least 2 that come to mind. You'll probably be familiar with one. That would be, are you talking about ancient sources or modern sources? Because for modern sources, I would say C.S., modern-ish. C.S. Lewis did that, but there was also another guy named Sir Alfred Lionel Luckhoo, who was a very prestigious attorney. But before I go into that, I want to make sure I'm answering your question. Do you mean ancient people that believe or modern people that believed because of this evidence that were originally non-Christian?
I mean, I wasn't really leaning either way. So, if you would talk about both.
Sure. So I'll start with Sir Alfred Lionel Luckhoo. So I think I have a slide on him as well. He was an absolute genius. So he won 245 murder charge acquittals in a row. He was knighted twice. He was a super intellectual guy. One day he was challenged to look into the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, which he happily considered, considering that he was an atheist. After looking into the evidence, he said that the evidence for the resurrection is known past doubt, and that he became a believer because of the evidence. C.S. Lewis did a very similar thing, but Sir Alfred Lionel Luckhoo, he's a super intellectual, so he ended up embracing Christianity just purely based off of the evidence, because he was challenged to do so. And Sir Lionel Luckhoo would be somebody that knows what good arguments are and what they're not, because he's constantly in court. And he's so good, like I said, he won 245 murder charge acquittals in a row. So he knows exactly what evidence is and what it's not. And if somebody's trying to feed him something that isn't good evidence, he's going to push it aside. So I think he was in a very unique position to learn that. As far as ancient sources go, I would say that the 2 best people would be James, the brother of Jesus, who was a skeptic, and the Apostle Paul. I don't know if you all have any siblings or anything, but it would probably take a lot for you to think that your brother was Jesus or the risen Christ, So I know that the New Testament describes James specifically as a doubter and a denier, and he thought his brother was crazy during his lifetime. But somehow after the resurrection, then James ends up converting and becoming a Christian. So that's a really interesting change of heart, so much so that James was willing to die. Now, this isn't in the Bible, but Josephus records that James ends up being martyred for his faith, and that's huge. It's he's not just this on paper. He actually was so confident that that he was wrong and that his brother is God that he went on and died for it. And that's someone who directly was directly knew Jesus, like related to him in that sense. And then, of course, there's Paul as well. Why would a Pharisee, so a super high-ranking Pharisee who's trained under Gamaliel, one of the best Pharisee and Pharisaical teachers of that time, he was all for Judaism. He wanted to get rid of the pagans and the Christians and everything. And then on his road to Damascus, he had this encounter. And that's the only thing I can really point to such a change of heart of a guy that was literally persecuting Christians. So I would say that those would be the ancient sources that I would point to. So I would point to those two for ancient times, and then for modern times, I would point to Sir Alfred Lionel Luckhoo and C.S. Lewis.
Close us out.
Yeah, go for it.
I could go round 5 too if you want. All right. Going back to, well, not to the Shroud of Turin, but like along the same lines.
Sure.
Do you think any of the relics that are held in like the cathedrals in Europe, like supposedly the Crown of Thorns is in Notre Dame, and there's shards of the true cross all over Europe. Do you think any of those are real?
I'm not sure. I haven't studied or looked into them, so I would rather just say I don't know than give you a bad, uneducated answer.
Fair enough.
Great. Well, that will conclude our time tonight. Again, big thank you to Mitchell for guiding us through that, and just a super well done presentation. That was great, and answering our questions too. And again, shout out to people from Bay Ridge for joining us. Glad we could do this all together. And well, anyway, let me close this in prayer, and we'll get on our way and bow our heads. Father, thank you for the truth of your gospel. Thank you, Lord, for humbling yourself in the form of man, Lord, and coming down and living a perfect life and bearing the weight of our sin on the cross, Lord. Thank you, Lord, that is not just a fairy tale or not just a comforting story that we tell each other, but, Lord, that is truth, and, Lord, that you truly bore the weight of the sin of the world, then defeated death in your resurrection. And, Lord, ask that we would not forget that. Thank you, Lord, that we can rest in that truth, Lord, knowing that we find salvation in you. Pray a blessing on this Easter weekend as we go out from here and as we celebrate your resurrection tomorrow. We pray all these things in your name.